Okay, so maybe we can start. It's a real pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, to Professor Benedetto Piccoli. Professor Piccoli is Joseph and Loretta Lopez Chair Professor of Mathematics at the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Rutgers University and Vice Chancellor for Research at the same university. So before joining Rutgers University, he was Research Director at the National Research Council of Italy, and in particular the Institute of Applications of Calculus, Mauro Piccona. So among the various honors that he received, we mentioned that he's fellow of the American Mathematical Society, and he received the Fubini Prize in 2009. So today he has been an advisor of more than 10 PhD students in Italy and in the US. So his laboratory includes projects of biomathematics, seeking to expand our understanding in a variety of research topics, spanning from circadian rhythms to disease transmission. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us, Benedetto, and the stage to you. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mattia, for a very nice introduction, and thank you, the whole group, UMI MSA, for this kind of invitation. I think that talking about COVID is not easy because the amount of work that has been done during these 3 years of pandemic, the amount of results and discussion renders really difficult to be original and say something new. But I will give a perspective about the role and future of epidemiological modeling for COVID-19 or any pandemic, hoping to propose something possibly new, or at least give some hints for discussion. So I will first talk a little bit about the background. Most of the things I'm sure all of you are familiar with and probably heard already a number of speakers in this series talking about. Then I will focus specifically on what my group did during these different phases of the pandemic and a possible perspective on where we can go from here. So the number of possible models for studying spreading of infectious disease are many, but let me say that among the most used to represent the real world are the very well-established compartmental model and the agent-based. Obviously, there are many other models, maybe at statistical level, but those two families are among the most popular, especially for applied mathematicians attacking these type of problems. Among the two, I would say the compartmental models were mostly used, or at least mostly used in some communities. And the work started very early during the pandemic. Since we are presented in an Italian group, let me mention just 4 of work that involved Italian researchers that appeared very early during the pandemic. I think that the first paper by Gatto and collaborator was among the very first one appearing with data from Italy, and they used an extension of the classical SEER model to include the geographical distribution of infection, and specifically the evolution that occurred in Italy with focus on Lombardy and then moving down the other region. Similar was the approach of Giordano Blanchini and other collaborators that still focused on data from Lombardy. Vespignani and his group at Northeastern wrote a number of papers in Science about specifically the start of the pandemic in Wuhan, and so a lot based on data from China. And finally, the very famous work of Dorigatti, Lavezzo, and collaborators based on the township of Vo in Veneto, and a very specific work that was done very early in the pandemic, and in particular elucidated a lot of the role of the non-symptomatic infected. So everyone knows SEER model started really almost 100 years ago with Kermack and McKendrick, and their initial model was really the simplest one, the so-called SIR, with the 3 compartments: susceptible, infectious, and recover. And despite its simplicity, this model is able to reproduce the initial phase of a pandemic. Indeed, in the original work of 1927, they even fitted the model to the date of the plague in the island of Bombay. So showing this typical curve of infection going up, reaching a maximum, and then decreasing that became so famous during the COVID-19 pandemic. But interesting enough, the models appeared so early and they were useful to elucidate some phases of the pandemic or even to be used for preventive measures, but they were also highly criticized. This picture here on the left I took from CDC, but appeared in many different other versions in different countries in the world, and is a well-known flattening of the curve. So the brownish one is the typical curve without protective measures, and with protective measure, mostly non-pharmaceutical, since at the beginning of the pandemic, neither vaccine nor cure were available, or no specific cures. Then the idea is that with this non-pharmaceutical measure, you delay somehow the peak and you keep it below the capacity of the healthcare system not to cause a collapse of it. A lot has been written. Let me say that essentially every country applied a strategy of this type. And this is really a role, I think, that the model played very early. Despite that, there was an increasing skepticism as early as May 2020. These were words from Anthony Fauci, essentially the main scientist involved in managing COVID-19 in the US. And he was saying, well, they are only as good as the assumption you put into them. And this is a shareable, obviously. Any model with bad data is not going to do much in terms of forecasting or even just describing reality. But it's also true that many other people described this situation with other words much before, like George Box's famous aphorism, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think that the debate about the capability or modality of detect the reality and predict has been always there. It was just revamped after COVID-19, and also it was made very popular. So the debate happened also not in scientific venues, but also on other media outlets. Interesting enough, the debate started extremely early. Like already in 2020, there were even publications debating the modeling and even discussing what modeling choice should be done. But in 2020, we were really just in the early phase of the pandemic, and much more happened later on. For instance, this picture depicts some specific dynamics that happened in New Jersey. And indeed, in a paper with Ored, Shiba, Hyman, and Mileko, in a book edited by Bellomo and Chaplain, we compared the dynamics in New Jersey and Hawaii. Let me spend maybe a couple of minutes on this picture. These are the 4 initial waves between 2020 and 2021 that occurred in the United States, and some specific dynamics of New Jersey. So you see, let me just analyze a little bit of wave 1. Wave 1 started essentially from New York for the northeastern area. And so you see the national trend is depicted here on the lower curve, and dividing New Jersey in 3 parts, and the northwest, that is a more rural area, the northeast, that is more urban and is essentially the metropolitan area of New York, and the southern New Jersey that is composed both of rural area and the metropolitan area of Philadelphia. You see that the wave clearly hit much more the northeast and earlier because of the vicinity of New York, and then later on the northwestern part, and the southern one was indeed a much smaller wave. And it's interesting to notice that comparing the national trends and the different areas of New Jersey, we already see an extreme richness. Like there was a kind of second wave just in the vicinity of July 4th, as was expected because it's a big national holidays, but indeed in New Jersey was not much felt. Wave number 2 that occurred in the winter between 2020 and 2021, the trend of New Jersey and national were pretty much close to the other. Interesting enough, wave 3 was more felt in New Jersey than national trend, and the opposite for wave 4. Let me notice also that, interesting enough, wave 4 was more felt in southern part of the state rather than the other ones. So you see there's been an extreme richness in the waves, and even in locations that differentiate, split in a state like New Jersey, that is not big state, in sub areas. So the analysis, indeed, we did perform some analysis all the way to township level, and this is pretty detailed. But let me just show one figure, and then I will come back to that later on during the talk. But this is essentially the cumulative cases per municipality during the first wave. And you see that it's clear the effect of the proximity to New York. So in this map, this is the whole New Jersey with all the municipality, and New York is located in this area. So you see that the most hit part of the state is the one in proximity to New York. And the other parts of the state, in particular the southern part, is much less affected. The experience in Hawaii was, I think, very interesting. It was not my group, it was the group of Monique Shibat that collaborated very strictly with the state in what you could call the team science, because they had experts in public policy, in sociology, public servant, and other people involved in managing the pandemic. The situation of Hawaii is, I would say, as far as possible for the New Jersey one, because in New Jersey, we are essentially a urban and rural area in between two big metropolises of New York and Philadelphia. Hawaii is completely different. It's a collection of islands. They are connected only by airplane. And so they had a very active management of the pandemic that was effective also because they could strictly control the access to the islands through, for instance, a safe travel program like it happened during 2020. And in that case, you see a very different dynamics between and after this safe travel program began. There are many more publications from the group of Monique Shibat that invite you to take a look if you are interested. So it's a very interesting case. And they had also pretty precise social demographic data of Hawaii. So they were able to indeed use a very profitably agent-based model. I would say probably more successfully than in any other place in the United States. So one message from these slides is that, well, we can have many different models, and the different models may be useful in different phases, and even the choice of the models may very strongly depend on the phase of the pandemic as well as the location where you are applying your model. But I will come back to that. Let me talk about other type of extensions on the classical SARE model that our group made, and obviously is not only our group, but many other groups worldwide followed similar approaches. And still the main base is the very original compartmental models, not directly the SARE model, but a modification of that. This picture, again, maybe sticking to models, is from a report that we released in early March of 2020 and was cited by New Jersey governor in a letter to the president to ask for emergency state. You see, these are the typical picture of how a pandemic could develop. In this case, we were measuring shortage in hospital beds in the southern part of the state if no reaction was going to happen to the pandemic. And this picture relates to the picture of the two curves I showed before. Essentially, with no or moderate intervention, we would have dramatic hospital bed shortage in the southern part of New Jersey, essentially all the counties. These are all the counties of New Jersey, and you see the effect of the wave would have been devastating already in April. With a strong measure, we would have pushed the wave at the level, say, of July of August, but indeed the measures were even stronger than the one we advocated for in early March. And so the wave was pushed all the way to the winter. The interesting point is that by the winter, people already forgot all these kind of predictions, and there was a lot of, in the public at least, surprise that the wave would come up towards the end of the year, while essentially all the epidemiological model would tell you that having put in place non-pharmaceutical measures, that's exactly what you would have expected. And later, and smaller way, well, smaller, or anyway, tamed the wave towards the end of the year. So very early during the pandemic, the non-pharmaceutical measures, including interventions like testing, social distancing, and contact tracing, we made one of the many works that were dedicated to try to understand this non-pharmaceutical measure. This model may sound a little bit complicated, but it's a natural extension of the SARE model, in which we made a distinction between asymptomatics and symptomatics, like many work did since the beginning of the pandemic. And we included quarantine and other population, as many other models made, indeed as early as the Gatto model used this. Now, we specifically modeled the 3 interventions. So a lockdown or social distancing intervention that are measured by a control function nu, plus 2 other controls called mu and delta that refers to the contact tracing, for instance, and the testing. For instance, these 2 terms are the terms by which, as an effect of contact tracing, you would remove a portion of the susceptible population and you would move into the quarantine compartment. Now, there are pros and cons in doing all these interventions. The pros, obviously, is management of the pandemic, and the cons are, for instance, their economic cost. That's why we propose to consider societal and economic cost of all these measures. And it's not easy to come up with the cost that makes sense, but we went through a number of works by economists and other people, and we came up with a cost made of 6 components. One component measured the cost of lockdown. So in New Jersey, for instance, was estimated that the cost of quarantining a person for 1 day in terms of, the lack of economic production is around $70 per person per day. Then we put other numbers there, again, taken from the literature, for instance, costing of testing and the contact tracing per person, the constant gain of quarantining, and then the cost of hospitalization. For hospitalization, we were using 2 different phases, in the sense that there is some natural cost that you can estimate, at least in US and New Jersey, and this is the cost of 1 hospital bed per day. But then this cost ramps up much more if you allow the pandemic to develop, and then you need to build a new hospital. So this is the cost per person per day in normal condition. And then we augmented the cost in case the number of hospitalizing exceeds the bed capacity in the state. And finally, you need to give a cost also to mortality. This is the typical cost that some insurance companies put, so 1.5 million per person. I will not enter the discussion on how this cost could be modified. But the interesting point is that you can solve optimal control problem, and you ask yourself, what is the best way of managing your pandemic? That will obviously depend both in these weights were example for New Jersey, but in different situations, you may have many, costs that may look very different. And the second point is the scenario. So we develop a few scenarios. This slide is a bit intense, but essentially it's a scenario in which we assume that for the first 2 weeks, no action is really possible because like similar to what happened in March 2020, the pandemic is pretty unknown. What I mean is that as the first case reveals, the pandemic probably is within the first couple of weeks of its development. So I want to point your attention that in this scenario, you see what the model tells you is that the best approach is very similar to what was done in reality. It is a phase of initial lockdown for around 2 to 3 months, followed by releasing the lockdown. Now, there are boundary effects in the cost, but we ran many different scenarios with the correction of the boundary effects. And the answer were pretty uniform in suggesting this initial lockdown. And the interesting point is that there is some value in performing testing, especially in the initial phase of the pandemic, but there is extremely low value in performing contact tracing. So there was a lot of investment in contact tracing, but apparently both economically and from the point of view of managing pandemic, the effectiveness of this measure is extremely limited. Starting 2021, as you know, a vaccine was developed. And so like many other groups, we started studying what could be done in a situation in which a vaccine was present. A number of models were proposed. In this case, we proposed a model in which we were taking into account many new different compartments. So first of all, you may happen to vaccinate people that have been exposed or that have been already infected. And not only that, but you have to create at least one new compartment of the vaccinated susceptible, because all vaccine had a given level of safety with respect to infection, but not 100%. So we complicated further the model, because one critical point of discussion during the initial phase of the vaccination campaigns, where if we should vaccinate essential workers first, or first the seniors, and so on and so forth. So we created a model with many compartments in which we were using age brackets. So distinguishing among, say, children, adolescents, young adult, and so on and so forth, with brackets all going all the way to 50 to 60, 60, 70, and 70 above. This was very important because, again, we were trying to minimize, in this case, just the number of deaths, also differentiating essential worker from non-essential worker. So the biggest differentiation were that the death toll, or the number of death per vaccinated people, is very different. As you know, the curve is very skewed towards the elderly. The mortality is much higher. And the second point is we use the interactive matrices that were taking into account both the age group. For instance, obviously, adolescents interact mostly in school setting and mostly among their age group, and to differentiate also the interaction of essential workers that are more exposed to interacting with people and so more exposed to infection. Again, let me just use one picture for all. We run many different scenarios in which, for instance, we vary the famous R naught variable, the replication rate, the percentage of, for instance, essential workers, and so on and so forth. But in most of the scenarios that we run, this is a heat map of a vaccination policy. So you see the dark one means which population is vaccinated at that time. And you see that the optimal policies most of the time was just going down by age. So vaccinated the population 70 and above, and then moving down. And really the effect of including essential or non-essential worker didn't change much the policy. Now, there were little oscillations in the optimal policy, sometimes in between the 1519 and the 2039, but these oscillations were really not much relevant. And as you know, the vaccine was released initially just for major age, at least in the United States, above 18, and only later on in the for the age bracket 15-19, indeed 16-19, and much later on in the pandemic for below 16. So all in all, the message here is that indeed, even in this case, the policymaker made the choice that were sensible, and then in particular that were contributing to minimizing the impact in terms of death, even keeping into account the role of essential workers. We didn't perform a complete analysis of the economic cost, and that would be maybe an interesting thing to be made. Another message that could be taken by this type of works is essentially the importance of vaccination. Even with the replication rate around 1.2, the cost in terms of number of deaths between the no vaccination, you see these blue histograms depending on different scenarios, and the different type of vaccination policies, like simply defend the vaccinated largest essential population first, or the optimal solution. The interesting point is that different vaccination strategy led, according to the model, to different number of deaths, but not dramatically different, while no vaccine is really the big difference in terms of death tolls. But as we know, during the pandemic, vaccination hesitancy, the resistance developed, so it changed completely the terms of the problem. Now, I think that this type of work, like, modifying the certain model to include different type of compartments, the disease projection, consider economic costs, vaccination phases, have been addressed by many different groups worldwide, and I think with a reasonable consistency about the type of answers that were proposed. Let me spend maybe a few minutes now about what I think could be still be done, what could be new, well, at least some ideas, and what can still be done now to managing the current pandemic that became essentially an endemic state for COVID, and for future pandemics, will them happen? So first of all, let me point a little bit attention on the virus mutability and the role played by the different mutations. So these are data from the GSED project, and comparing two states, very different one in United States. So this type of graph describes the dominance of one variant over another. So you see the total of one is just the total number of cases detected, or for which there was some DNA sequence activity that allowed identifying the specific variant in patient. And you see, this is a typical figure. In the first phase of the pandemic, we had usually the original Wuhan variant dominating, and then we started to have all these variants. Towards the end of 2020, we see clearly the Alpha variant, and then we see other variants dominating later on. Washington, D.C., as you know, is a city, is District of Columbia, is in between other states, is very well connected. And what you see in terms of alternation of pandemic, including the more recent phase with Omicron, is pretty much we're seeing in many other parts. But interesting enough, in Alaska, during the phase of Alpha, there was a completely different variant that was dominating, a variant that appeared in Mexico and essentially was present in Mexico and Alaska, but not much in any other parts of the United States. But what we did is really try to relate the data from GSED about the variants with the data of daily cases from the Johns Hopkins University repository. And you see, this is a picture obtained for New Jersey merging the two data sets. The solid black curve are the 14 days average of daily cases. So you can clearly see the first wave of the pandemic, then the second wave, a possible third wave, and then the Delta wave in 2021, the big Omicron wave in early 2022, and then the various other Omicron waves. Now, the main point here, so how we obtained here again is comparing the daily cases, the black curve, and then filling up the curve with the different variants using the GSED data. And you see, well, initially in the pandemic, we didn't have that many data, but you clearly see what happens here. Whenever a new variant is taking over, you have a peak in number of cases. So for instance, when the Alpha variant took over around this area, so it's around early 2021, we clearly see a peak there. Then when the Delta dominated, we clearly see that after the Delta started dominating, we have a typical peak in cases, very much similar to the original SEER model would predict. And finally, this is very big wave related to the first Omicron variant in early 2022, and then other waves related to other subvariants of the Omicron. So the main message, this is just a figure, but in the papers, we made a more extensive data analysis to try to give a meaning to the essential graphical observation here that cases in peaks in second phases of the pandemic was mostly due to the appearance of new variants. For trying to capture this type of dynamics, we proposed a couple of models. One was coupling the original simple SEER model of variants of that with Markov chains. A Markov chain in that case would be just a matrix that would change the probability of being infected from one variant to another as a function of time and the total number of infected population. The model is pretty simple, and that's obviously limitation because you need to prescribe a priori the number of variants you expect are going to play a role. But you see, it's already enough to describe, at least qualitatively, what we observed in New Jersey. So this is the number of total infected, and these are the infected by 4 variants that we put in the model that would reproduce the alpha, beta, gamma, and delta variants. So the first 4 variants. And we clearly see that, you see, there is an alternating of dominated between one variant and the other. One of the main reasons is obviously the different level of infectivity of the different variants. In particular, delta was significantly more infective and so took over the other variants. But you see, it's pretty consistent, and there is a reasonable qualitative matching of the data. As you know, the number of variants indeed around more than a year ago, or a year and a half, was already above the 2 million of different sequences of variants. And they are typically grouped in families. This is one of the possible representation from covariance.org website. You can very well see the famous alpha, gamma, the delta, and the new Omicron family that took over more recently. So indeed, there are so many variants that one may argue that it's possible to try to come up with models that would use a continuum space of variants. And what we did is use a type of equation that were introduced recently that are essentially a very natural generalization of ordinary differential equation called measure differential equation. There are a few other names that people used more recently, but let me just stick to this name. Anyway, let me give the very rough idea of what is a measure differential equation. Let's think to what is an ordinary differential equation or system ordinary differential equation from a bit geometric point of view. So assume that you have a system of ODEs or a dynamical system defined on a manifold. Then this is equivalent to assign a vector field, which is nothing but a map that's associated to every point x, a vector v of x. From the language of manifold, so more geometric point of view, this is a map that indeed is associated to a point x in a manifold, a point on the tangent bundle x v of x, so that the point x v of x indeed contains the component x, that means v of x is really an element of the fiber over the point x. Now, there is obviously a natural embedding of any manifold in the space of probability measure of the same manifold by identifying any points with the Dirac mass center in the point itself. In that sense, that map, that is a vector field, would become a map from a probability measure on the manifold, the Dirac mass center at x, to a probability measure on the tangent bundle, the Dirac delta center at the point x v of x. But more generally, we can assume that to have a map that to any measure on the base associate a measure on the tangent bundle, with the only requirement that it projects back down nicely. So you see, for the case of IDE, projecting down nicely means just that the point x v of x is indeed over the point x, because if we would associate a member of the tangent bundle, an element of the tangent bundle that is over some other point, that wouldn't make much sense in the sense that the vector field will no more represent a possible infinitesimal displacement starting from that point. Similarly, we define the probability vector field as a map that associates to a probability measure on, say, Rn, to fix a manifold, to the tangent bundle, so that if we project it down over the first component of the measure through the using the push forward, we recover the measure mu. In other terms, if you look at the total mass over on a fiber over a point, this is equal to the total mass at that point of your original measure. Like in a vector field, the vector represents a potential infinitesimal displacement. Similarly, here, the measure on the fiber would represent the possible displacement of the mass located at that point at this point in many possible directions, not a unique one. So you may include, for instance, diffusion phenomenon, concentration phenomenon, and other phenomena that are not possible by standard ODEs. But it's a very natural generalization, and it's indeed an embedding, essentially, of ordinary differential equations into the general space of measures and evolution equations for measures. So formally, once you introduce a probability vector field, you can formally write mu dot is equal v of mu, and you intend the solutions in weak sense. Obviously, we are dealing with measure. So a curve μt would be solution of this equation if the derivative of the integration against a test function, for instance, the infinity with compact support, would satisfy this equation. This is nothing but the integral with respect to v of mu, that is a measure on the tangent bundle of the gradient of f dot v. So this is exactly the weak formulation of this equation. So the theory was developed in a paper in ARMA in 2019, and more recently, Savary and his group, Frankowska and his group proposed a different type of approaches for other type of evolution equations for measures that are somehow related to this type of equations. So what we did is try to couple a typical SEER model with a measure differential equation that would capture both the dynamic of infected, but also some terms coming from an ND that will reproduce diffusion. So we are at the initial stage. The interesting point is that you can develop a theory by coupling MDs and ODs. This was done with Gong in a paper in NHM. And then in a more recent paper in 3AS, we also tried to use to mimic the evolution in a potential space of variants and mutations with this model. This type of picture, for instance, from one of the scenarios, you see this is the space of mutation, this is the days, and this is the number of infected that would depend on the specific variant you are following. Clearly, there are various limitations also in this type of models because you would have some kind of representation of the space of variants and some kind of way of measuring what is the probability of getting infected by a new variant once you were infected by a previous variant. These are non-trivial questions, but the interesting point is that these new classes of models are able to start shedding some lights on how it looks like a pandemic when you have this richness in terms of appearance of variants. Let me move on and discuss probably about the last thought on what is the future. Well, NSF now is pushing a lot for collaborations between scientists that use the model for COVID-19 pandemic with social scientists to include some social elements into the models. Now, obviously, a lot of work has already been done, but probably a lot can still be done in terms of trying not only to propose models, but also trying to see if these models are able to explain some of the phenomena observed during the pandemic and have some predictive capability. We are working in this area. I don't want to present yet result, but I want to rather discuss how complicated is the reality once you look at socio-demographic data. Again, in this case, I'm looking back to the first wave in New Jersey and the third wave, and again, separated by township. Well, there are some phenomena that are really not that easy to explain. Again, as I mentioned, you looking at more intense effect of the pandemic because of proximity with New York in first wave, it's a very easy graphical observation that can be rendered quantitative. But there are a little bit more of mysteries, like the Hoboken township that is located exactly in the urban area of New York. So these are all township made up of communities that most of which work in the city, in New York City. And you see, it's a kind of singularity. Hoboken had a relatively low incidence in the first wave in terms of cases per 100,000 inhabitants. And there are some socio-demographic explanations that are based mostly on ethnic component and in terms of the per capita salaries and incomes. Again, preliminary analysis, but it's interesting to notice that you see all the nearby townships, they present very similar characteristics in terms of the work population and the type of work. All of them essentially commute with New York. But these are small areas that is also highly densely populated. experienced a much lower pandemic effect. On the opposite side, in the third wave, where the South Jersey counties were affected more by the wave, probably because it came essentially from Philadelphia, no more New York, you see that all the southern New Jersey was affected. Now, the rural area typically are less affected than Pennsauken and Camden, that are the urban area close to Philadelphia. But Hamilton, that is a very rural area, is an extremely particular exception there, where they have an enormous high incidence. And there are a very specific explanation, because there are a lot of highly densely populated areas that are related to immigrant workers in the farms. So it's extremely complicated to try to capture the socio-demographic variables that are responsible of micro variations, even township to township, here in New Jersey, and so in many other countries. So I think that despite the fact that a number of models were already proposed, take into account socio-demographic data and in general human factor components, I think that we are still in the phase of infancy, and a lot can be done in that area. Let me conclude my talk by thanking the people that made this possible, starting with the lab members. The ones that work specifically on this project are Sean McQuaid, Ryan Waitman, Samantha Moroni, Temitope Akinode, and Anthony Sbarra. Many external collaborators, Trela from Sorbonne, Samara Raniake Cornell, Orred, Rutgers were from Vanderbilt, as well as Barbour, Merrill, PNNL, Clemson, Lua from Clemson, Diaz from Caltech, and Yadav also from Rutgers. Obviously, let me thank the sponsor, mostly National Science Foundation, the Rutgers Center for COVID-19 Response and Pandemic Preparedness, and Rutgers Camden. You see, this is a typical lab meeting with the subgroup working on COVID. They seem to have a lot of fun, so I hope that you also had some good time listening to this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benedetto. So, are there any questions? Yeah, please.
I have a question, two questions actually. The first one is less serious, and it is about this picture. Where is food? Because usually in lab meetings, people are happy if there is also food that they can eat during work. I don't see any food here.
I didn't take the picture, as you can imagine, because I'm there, but
Yes.
the person taking the picture is hiding the pizza that is behind him. That's why everyone is smiling.
Okay, and the second question, the serious one, is about the coupling with Markov chain that at some point you mentioned. And I would like to ask you to give a bit more details about this coupling, because I was not able to see actually the coupling in the equations you showed.
Okay, let me move back, and is this slide?
Yeah.
Mildly coupled in the following sense. Here is the typical SEER model, right?
Yeah.
And we put an index I, but this time I is differentiating by variant. So susceptible are susceptible, just a unique populations, but the infected are differentiated by variant. So you will have a population I1, for instance, corresponding to alpha variant, I2 to beta, gamma, delta, and so on. So once they are infected, then they use, they go on with the usual evolution. And obviously you can have reinfections. In the second model, I included reinfection. This is, very standard when you deal with these models, right? This is the typical expression of a Markov chain. So what happens is that at a discrete time called delta t, usually we do maybe every 7 days or 30 days, we assume that there is the appearance of new variants or the movement of variants. This means that within infected individuals, new variants appears. Now, this is a probabilistic method, so really you need to tune the variables to the probability that a new variant would appear. And that's why there is the coupling, not only because here the population of infected changes because of this matrix moving from variant to another, but also because this matrix that makes the typical transition of the Markov chains depends on the total number of infected population. In other terms, you assume that you need enough infected people for new variants to be generated. Because the probability, obviously, of new variants to appear depends on the number of infected population, and so the chances that the virus has to mutate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
There is another question from Andrea.
I have a question.
Andrea Pugliese.
Yes. Hello, interesting talk.
Hi.
I have a
Thank
question about contact tracing. I'm not exactly sure how you modeled that because it was too little to understand it.
I'm
was
sorry.
wondering, and the fact that you say it's not particularly cost effective, because I have seen some other modeling done in a completely different way in which they try to follow the tree of contacts. And so, for instance, was done by the group of Fraser and also by Francesca Scarabella, who is here. Maybe she can say something more. And they don't discuss cost, but they show that it can be quite effective if done in properly. So I was wondering, so one of the things they were discussing is how fast was the contact tracing with respect to cases. I was wondering how you simulate this over here.
Yeah. So let me first model, re-quoting again George Box, that obviously, there is not a unique answer about how the contact tracing is important for one or the other, but depends really on the problem that you are addressing and the model that you are using. So I'm not surprised that other models may have reached different conclusions. Now, here the model is very simple. You assume that once some contact tracing means that, it depends on the people that you tested. And once some tested positive, then you are gonna have isolation for those and then contact tracing for people that were in contact with those. So we try to represent that by assuming that this is the number of people that were quarantined because discovered to be positive through a test. And we assume they were coming essentially from the asymptomatic. And then there is an effect, a cascade effect of quarantining some susceptible that were not infected because of contact tracing. And this explains this term here that is moving some people from susceptible to susceptible quarantine because of contact tracing. So they were people that were in contact with people that happened to test positive. It's not a unique way of doing that. There are some complications because it may depend by the specific way the contact trace is made. But the specific answer of the lack of effectiveness of the contact tracing that was in this scenario, let me specifically point out the following. Here we are assuming that there is a policymaker that is trying to contrast the pandemic by essentially minimizing that cost that keeps into account both minimizing death, because there is a part of the cost that is related to death, minimizing hospitalization, but also not incurring in a too high economic cost in terms of quarantining and lockdown. When you bring together all the three possible, they are seen as controls. So the first one related to lockdown measures, or in general social distancing, the contact tracing and the testing, in most of the scenarios, this is just one of the scenarios, we looked at many scenarios, many times what happens in this type of scenario in which you assume that a pandemic starts from scratch and you don't detect probably for, say, a couple of weeks or so, most of the times it appears that the initial lockdown, like most of the countries did, is very effective. And the contact tracing is effective on the very initial phase, like probably a month. And then it loses effectiveness for what concerns these specific costs. again, I'm not saying that it's not effective in terms of diminishing the impact of the pandemic, but in these specific scenarios, once a lockdown started, the contact tracing and even testing is effective in the very initial phase of the lockdown, because still there are people that are probably exposed and they're still developing, but passing that is no more that effective. And in many scenarios, we didn't see it appearing back again. This scenario is a single variant scenario. So this scenario was work that we did pretty early on. And so we were not focusing on different variants. I wouldn't be surprised that in more complicated dynamics, like the one that we represented by many variants like this one, in which you see the cases have multiple waves because of passage from one variant to another. We didn't do yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that if you include here not only lockdowns, but testing and contact tracing, then at that point, probably testing and contact tracing would become effective. Indeed, I can even tell you that New Jersey State essentially abandoned contact tracing during probably after the Delta wave, because seemed to be not so effective. They were not using models, they were looking at numbers, but definitely reinserted aggressive testing and contact tracing during the Omicron wave. And I think that during the Omicron wave, it was incredibly well managed for what you can do, because there was a lot of social distancing measures during the very early phase of the Omicron wave, like the month of January 2022. But then almost all the measures were relaxed pretty quickly. And thanks to a combination of the three social distancing testing and contact tracing, they were able to manage, from my personal opinion, pretty well. For instance, in Rutgers, we did close for the month of January, and then we opened back in person, but keeping masking and social distancing in the classroom settings. So the picture there is that assume there is an initial phase of a pandemic, really pretty much was early 2020. Then in that case, a lockdown is what it matters most. And the contact tracing and testing start to lose their importance pretty early now. I bet that the picture would be different if we include further variants down the road.
Thank you. Very clear.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So there is another question from Francesca Scarabelli.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for the talk. Actually, yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is on the final part of the talk, when you presented the measure differential equations. I was wondering, when you think at this space where you define the measure, do you imagine, so I can understand it's difficult to define a variable that actually describes the different variants. I was wondering if you imagine this variable to be more linked to the genetic or the phenotypes of the virus. And the other question is, how do you actually implement the emergence of new variants here? You mentioned diffusion, I think, if I didn't misheard, but I was wondering how you, how this emergence of new variants can be incorporated in the framework.
No, absolutely, very important question. So let me say that obviously this is a theoretical framework, but the problem of identifying an appropriate space to represent variants is absolutely a key question. Now, as early as 2021, to my knowledge, people made some attempt, obviously based on genetics, on mapping the variants, right? Defining some type of variants. Obviously, there are possible maps you can construct, like these typical maps, right, of the initial variant and all the other variants that emerge and how they are linked genetically one to another. This is not enough to produce a well-defined landscape of variants, but as you can imagine, it's already a starting point. And MD is a very general language. So you could imagine that one possibility is to define a branching evolution, a branching process for describing the appearance of variants. Now, there is obviously the question mark of how can you predict when a variance will emerge, in which moment, and the likelihood of one variance emerging rather than another one. I'm not a big expert of that area. My knowledge comes mostly from discussion with experts. There is a big body of work around how variants may appear and which variants could be viable. And they are based on, very advanced molecular dynamic simulations of the protein involved in the scaffolding of the virus itself. But I don't want to provide an answer because it's really not my field. What I want to say is that I think there is a lot of active ongoing research that I think is giving some promise of possibly making attempts to define a variance landscape on which one could define a process, for instance, a branching process, to be inserted in this mathematical framework, but definitely a very important and difficult problem.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask another question on the first part of the talk? I was impressed by trying to quantify the costs of the interventions because I believe that's very difficult. And I was wondering, maybe you mentioned that already and I missed it, but when you found the optimal strategy, do you also have besides counting the costs, and I believe the deaths here are the driving costs, do you also impose some constraints like that the peak of the hospitalization is below a certain threshold, or that or like social costs, like we cannot keep a lockdown indefinitely because people will suffer, like social costs besides economical costs?
Yes to both, but the second indirectly. So for hospitalization, I'm sorry, I just briefly mentioned and I didn't specify well, but essentially the function psi is made of two pieces. So as long as you are below the health system hospital beds capacity, you use this number that we took from New Jersey state data. So they estimate for a person that is hospitalized with COVID, probably making we get more complicated if we differentiate ICU from other type of beds, right? But the ballpark, the cost per day of a person hospitalized with COVID was estimated to be around $2,700 per day. Okay, so that's our cost as long as the level of hospitalized people keep below the hospital bed availability. That is a very well-known datum. For instance, in New Jersey, these are public data. When that number exceeds, and for the control problem, it may happen that they exceed that number. Then we have an additional cost that is much higher, which takes into account the realization and opening of camp hospitals or other forms of on-the-go hospitals, if you want. They happened, as you know, in various parts. Like I remember in Italy, in Lombardy, they were opening new ICU units in various parts of the region. Here in New Jersey, they opened in the New York area, but even here in South Jersey, close to Atlantic City, so they were essentially hospitals that were built up in a month. They were going there. Some were tents, some they were more other type of more than buildings were really most were tents indeed. But anyway, they were built up very rapidly. And then the other big problem was, as you know, recruiting the personnel, because the healthcare personnel were already very stretched. And when you open those kind of additional hospital, you incur an enormous number of costs, including the recruitment that is very, very costly. So that cost was bumped up to, if I remember now on top of my mind, more than $10,000 per person per day. And that was, again, an estimate based on the New Jersey data. This is extremely variable because, as you can imagine, even if you program that a wave will be unavoidable, it depends on the size of the wave, which type of hospital will be forced to open in which location, and so on and so forth. But it was made of two pieces. For what concerns the lockdown, this is just one of the possibility. We were using also a cost that was blowing up when you were essentially quarantining everyone, or, you know, a cost that would become very big. So we were not modeling what you are, I think, referring to, that is sometimes called lockdown fatigue. So people really start to be non-compliant because they are exhausted by responding to the non-pharmaceutical measure, but rather we were using a cost that was so high in total lockdown that the optimal solution would naturally tend to have, here is one scenario, a limited time lockdown, because otherwise the cost was unsustainable economically.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? So if not, we thank the speaker again.
Yeah. So maybe we can also remind everybody that we will continue with the seminars. More or less once each month, we will continue with this series of online seminars. And the next one will be on March 1st by Mario Di Bernardo. And thanks again to everybody and to Benedetto Piccoli for his talk.
Thank you very much to all of you for the invitation following my seminar.